Welcome to the UW Black Studies Centre Black History Month celebration, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Esther Adiemo, and I am the Graduate Research Assistant at the Black Studies Centre. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, and the complexities of COVID, all of our conferences and webinars are going to be online. We do value your thoughts and encourage you to please use the chat and the Q&A to sort of get involved and make sure you kind of get your ideas out there. And we would love to kind of, even though it is virtual, we do want to create that space in which we can all kind of interact and share ideas and thoughts. Again, thank you so much for being here. And without further ado, please allow me to introduce tonight's moderator, the founding director of the UW Black Studies Centre, Dr. Fredrick Douglass Dixon.
Thank you so much, Esther, and thank you for helping us and working with us. And we have a very busy schedule, and I know you're up for it, but here we go. All right, so we want to begin the conversation tonight that is a very important conversation. It's very germane to contemporary and traditional historic ways of thinking in America. So today we're going to discuss the Negro question and American exceptionalism. Well, what do we mean by American exceptionalism? Well, let's just break that term down. We're going to deal directly with the Negro question, and let's get this with a firm definition. The Negro question in itself comes from the Mohawk Conference of 1890, the first Mohawk Conference of 1890. Now, this space was a space where the North and South declared they would do their best to hash out some of the things or the complexities of those things that had continued to be problematic between the North and the South after the Civil War. So this is a very unique conference. What comes from this conference is the Negro question, but let me take a step back. Guess who presided over this conference? Rutherford B. Hayes.
Oh, wow.
And when we think about Rutherford B. Hayes and the history of Rutherford B. Hayes, one of the things that we can clearly connect him with in a very straightforward way is the ending of the social movement that was called Reconstruction. We can also connect him with the Tilden Hayes election of 1876 and 1877, the Compromise of 1877. So in context, Rutherford B. Hayes becomes very important to the ending of Reconstruction, but also the Negro question. And I'm going to read the Negro question, and then we'll do some introductions, and then we'll go right into it. So the Negro question reads, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? Let me read that again. What should be done with the question? What should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? So this question is never posed by Blacks, but imposed on Blacks by avaricious white men, particularly in this particular time. Now think about this. In 1890, there's this conference. 1891 is part 2 of the conference. But realistically, what America was dealing with was how would they move into the 20th century with this newly freed slave, this newly freed population of people that were considered less than human. So when we think about that, 1890, what comes right behind it? 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. What comes of that is separate but equal on the books as the law of the land. So one question that it answers very quickly, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? Let's make sure that we understand to have them separated, not to live with them in concert. But that question itself, the Negro question, had asked and answered itself prior to the Mohawk Conference. Think about slavery. What should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? Free labor. So when we think about it that way, I want to introduce Dr. Terry Scott from Hood College, and she's the chair of the history department. I want to introduce one of my favorites and someone who's a mentor, Dr. Winbush out of Morgan State, and then Dr. James Peebles, right here from Cheyenne, and a mentor as well. So when we think about that, and I want to introduce you all to some really good people too. Everybody take a look. This is the introduction to African American Studies class here at the University of Wyoming. Everybody wave, good people. So part of their course on Monday night is to be a part of these conversations. So we want to make sure that you all are participating and engaging in such a way. So you guys will be responsible for some questions, and then we'll go right live to you all. Very different than we did last week, but we'll come live and we'll have questions directly from here. And feel free to use the chat and the Q&A to forward your questions and your concerns and your comments. So Dr. Scott, when you think about the origin of the Negro question, if you could give us your thoughts on how that looks historically, and then from there, feel free to expound.
Right. So thank you very much for having me. First, I want to put out there and say something about terminology. So I recognize that in that historic moment, they're referring to it as the Negro question. What I want to make sure of for those who are joining us and speaking with us this evening and asking questions, that is an antiquated term, and it is not a term in the absence of using it in its historical period that we should then go out tomorrow and say, okay, well, all of these scholars said Negro, so now I can say Negro in conversation. So I just wanted to add an asterisk to that conversation. We are using it very specifically historically. It is not something that people should use today. So when we think about quote unquote, the Negro question that was posed in 1890, the question, for instance, which is an extension of this, of the color line that Du Bois would talk about closer to the turn of the century, what is at the core of that question? To your point, Dr. Dixon, you were saying in this particular historical moment, we are dealing with a reordering of a racial hierarchy. We are in a post-Reconstruction era with a generation of enslaved people who are now free, who are now engaging in freedom expressions such as building community, voting, at least voting until the end of Reconstruction when Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president, who are establishing themselves in freedom. And so those freedom expressions, the political power that they had gained, that the South would refer to as quote unquote Negro domination, and that they would work to stop for 100 years. The education of African Americans, these are the things that would essentially pose a question at the turn of the century, what do we do? Now it's an issue of perspective. And so there are those who would say, how do we continue to facilitate this growth? But there are so many others who would say, how do we end this growth? What can we put in place to make sure that African Americans don't advance? And so you have these kinds of Jim Crow regime that is trying to stop an advancement, but you have a resilient people on another side who are pushing against this and who are finding ways to navigate these new social landscapes to make sure that they could continue to live in their freedom expressions.
Thank you. Excellent way to look at it. Dr. Peebles, when you begin to talk about the historical content of the Negro question, can you give us your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Doctor, for having me. And I hope to be able to share some ideas with you. And, you know, you young scholars are beefed up to the new, to the new era, the new talk, and the new information. Well, you know, the Negro question, it has been existing since 1619, actually, really. But the fact is, what I see, or the way I see it, is that there was no Negro question before the Civil War. As one of the guys said in the book at the conference, before the Civil War, there was no Negro question because we had everybody under control. We had them under control. Okay, so what? They are free now, what, about 25 years? About 7 or 8 million blacks manumitted, been in bondage for 200 years or more, bodiless slaves, etc. They were just turned loose. So the question is going to evolve from the fact of how this thing started from the beginning. They were just turned loose. Actually, they didn't even know how to proceed. Blacks had been entirely dependent upon the master slave for all their wants and all their necessities. There was no place to go. They had not been accustomed to deciding what they would wear, eat, when and where they would sleep, or actually of what they could talk about. So my thought on this primarily is that the question is, that was the white question. It's always been that way to me, the white question, because blacks have never invaded a country and enslaved millions of people and etc. Maybe once, during the time of, I say, the Muslims with the Moors, etc. in Europe. But other than that, that has just been just one particular element at one time. The Negro question is based upon the white question. It's dangerous, it's worrisome, because everybody looks at the Negro as being shiftless, no good, mongrel, women chasing, especially the black males, because that's the question. That's what brought out the question. So what are we going to do with them? And that was no other than a little provisions from the organization there, the banks, the Freeman's Bureau. There was nothing else that aided the people. By the way, they don't even realize the slaves' attitudes at this particular time. They gave them no kind of coercion, anything. What most of the slaves were doing for the first 25 years, and I think it's about 25 years before this conference, that they were freed, manumitted, they were trying to find their children and their families. They had no welfare system. They had no one to look out for them. They, just like you said, Rutherford B. Hayes had just knocked down the barrier against them anyway. So if they were just almost free for grabbing, they were looking for their children. They were looking for their families. Some of them couldn't proceed anyway because they were handicapped. Many of them were crippled doing slavery. So you have this multitude of people free. What are they going to do? They're going to do the best they can. Naturally, there are going to be mongers among them that's going to be criminals and etc. That's everywhere. But in thinking of when reading this book, is that that is just hell for the most of them. One criminal, whatever. And, many of them were called, even looked upon as almost inhuman. So the odds, this Negro question, the odds almost like today are still in front of us because it's a white question. What are we going to do with the white race, with the attitude that has been perpetrated on black folk for 400 years? I mean, that's a beginning, my thought. I mean, shaky.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Peebles. Come right to you, Dr. Winbush. The historical presence of this question, and what's your take on it as far as a power dynamic at this time?
Well, I'm always interested in how the system of white supremacy weaponizes words. So when we have the Negro question, it's a question that it really means, what are we going to do with this person or these people that we enslaved for 250 years? Keep in mind that just before the Mohawk Conference, the Berlin Conference divided up Africa, and they were asking the same thing. How can we exploit Africa without having people fighting each other, the Europeans fighting each other? And so, I don't think that, white people were interested in what the Negro question was. First of all, there were no Black folk invited to the conference. T. Thomas Fortune, the editor, said having a conference like this was like having Hamlet, have a conference about Hamlet and not inviting Hamlet. So you know, to me, it just shows how the system of white supremacy tries to justify it, you know, itself like it's really doing something for Black folk, and it really isn't. You know, the 2 years of the conference, I mean, virtually nothing came out of it except more suppression of the Black person. As you said earlier, the Plessy versus Ferguson followed just a few years after that. And prior to that, the Berlin Conference. So on a global level, the system was trying to say, what do we do with these people that we've enslaved, colonized, and you know, what do we do with it? They had created a Frankenstein monster and they were trying to resolve, what do I do with it?
Thank you, Dr. Winbush. We just had a short skit or a short way for this class that meets once a week. And many of them were introduced to, and some were reintroduced to King Leopold. And that comes directly from that conference. So on a global scale, how do we split Africa up into 50 irregular countries? And then on a local scale, if you will, a national scale, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? So Dr. Scott, how about the power of the fluidity and the flexibility of this class, of this particular question to gain momentum, keep itself alive, and then restructure itself on a regular basis?
Are you asking about more this kind of historical continuum
Sure.
of the question?
I mean, we
Right.
think about the early 1900s. We've gone up until Plessy versus Ferguson. So what happens in the 1900s? Well, we see quickly that the 1900s, well, let's take a step back. We see directly after the Civil War and this so-called win of the Civil War, and then we look at what we call white massive resistance. And when we talk about white massive resistance in the Civil War, we talk about the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, 1866, Pulaski, Tennessee. That's only a year after the victory for the North. So when we think about Ku meaning small, Klux meaning circle, Klan meaning family, and you know, we think about those original members, Mr. Lester, Mr. Hayes, Mr. Crow, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Jones, Mr. Reed, Mr. McCord, to understand that as a direct response. And then we look about 1900 and we see the eugenics movement. So all of these things are responses to so-called or practical progress within this particular population. So how flexible is the Negro question?
I think there are a couple of ways to think about that. And really it causes us to think about how then do we frame and categorize the African-American history in this post-emancipation era all the way until today, right? So there are a couple of ways to think about it. The first way to think about it is what has been described and how we have been failed and how we have been able to be resilient. So for instance, when we talk about freedom in the Civil War and when freedom has come to African Americans, the way I teach it and talk about it is I tell people freedom was a process. If you think the Emancipation Proclamation freed African Americans, you're probably in the company of 90% of Americans, but we know that's not actually what happened. It was up to them to free themselves. That was freeing people who were in rebelling territories, which means that they are still enslaved. So what is the process of freedom in the Civil War? The process of freedom began with self-emancipation. It began with over 500,000 African Americans taking to the streets, to the forest, running away, leaving, going to Canada, going to Mexico, going to Haiti, going just a couple of miles from where they lived so that they could engage in their own freedom. So what does that tell us? This is not a people who are waiting for somebody to do something for them. They are the ones who are actually making Lincoln make the war about the end of slavery. They are the ones who are changing the tide. That, if we think about that, that is a continuous theme from the end of the Civil War until now. So why is that? When we think about what is this quote unquote Negro problem, this is a question of, as you all have posed, what to do with individuals. But then we turn it around and say, no, how are we going to make America, as Dr. King says, cash that check and make sure that they allow us, that they bring us into the fold of American democracy? That is something that has not stopped, that we continue to have to push, whether it is in a post-emancipation era, a post-Emmett Till era or a post-George Floyd era, that we are in a continuous process of saying, number one, look what's happening. Believe me when I tell you what's occurring. And number two, here is what we are going to do about it. Now, I'm not going to fool myself and say we haven't worked with others and allies. Absolutely. We can look at a number of people who are not Black who were killed in the civil rights movement to say people were willing to sacrifice themselves for what has happened. But we always have to then be mindful of saying, here is what exists, not just in the South, because when we talk about Plessy versus Ferguson, or even Williams versus Mississippi in 1898, that said, yeah, you can use a literacy test because it's not actually discriminatory and all of these other things. This was not Southern exceptionalism. As Malcolm X said, everything below Canada had racism and had white supremacy that was defining how they were treating African Americans. And so it brings it back to us. We have to continue with what we're doing. We have to continue to push against voter suppression like we are today. We have to continue to expose the issues so that we can challenge them. And so the issues change, but the energy has to be maintained. Unfortunately, that's just our reality.
Excellent answer. Okay, before we go any further, we'd like to have everybody help us out just a little bit. Toby, if you could put those poll questions up, so you all, we're going to get a few answers from your thought. Toby, when you're ready, yes. Please find a way to answer those questions, good people. Dr. Stevenson, thank you for joining us. All right. Thank you. Thank you all of you who answered. Thank you. So I want to go back to you, Dr. Peebles. What do you think about the power of the Negro question as far as its flexibility, its ability to maintain asking and answering and posing this question by others?
Oh, say that again. I had a little static in my.
Can you hear me now, Dr. Peebles?
Yeah, you good. Go ahead. Say
when
that.
we think about the flexibility of the Negro question,
Okay.
the idea of those who pose the question, impose that question, and how it continues to have this flexible, if you will, rebirth.
Okay, I still had a breakup, but let me see if I got it correct.
Go right ahead, Dr. Peebles.
I didn't understand.
Go right ahead, Dr. Peebles.
Okay, well, I'm hoping I heard your question correctly about the imposing of the Negro question. I just didn't hear it.
That'll be just fine. Go with that, Dr. Peebles. That's perfect.
Well, okay, now let me just go with something here. Okay, back to this conference that we're talking about. You know, we have conferences all the time. We have conferences today, but how well are we represented? It was stated at the beginning that there was no Black at the conference. That's true, very true. That was William Lloyd Garrison, you know, but where was Fredrick Douglass, you know, his cohort, you know. So we're going to talk about what is the Negro problem without asking the Negro. Not only during that time, prior to that conference, or a little after that conference, there were many publications that were put out. And one of the publications that was at that time that hit the market and was quite a sensation was the Negro, a Beast, or the Image of God, Charles Cowell. That book was popular. And so it was written to aggravate and to assert and to explore the two races, especially the white race against the black race, to give some type of substantiation why the Negro needs to be tamed, because it all goes back to before the Civil War, we had black folk. But you know, the Civil War is also being used as a fence, imaginary fence, even to this day. We are being, I say, somewhat crucified once more for things in the past that were actually alive then and still alive today. And talk about the Negro question. It goes back to how you're going to treat human beings. Well, the Negro question is not too bad for whites because they say the Negro is a beast. And other books that were written at that particular time, and you know, well, one guy I just like to mention, William St. Clair, The Aftermath of Slavery. He was African American. He wrote this book just a little before the conference, and it tells us actually the attitude, the spirit these people had before the conference actually convened. I believe that's the point I wanted to make, because I didn't hear that question too well. Dr. Dixon, can you hear me? Okay, thank you, that's it.
All right, that takes us to Dr. Winbush. Dr. Winbush, the flexibility of the Negro question, and I would like for you to add the second part of the component today is American exceptionalism, the Negro question and American exceptionalism. Well, how about the way that we can tie this in and say the Negro question and white supremacy? That gives us a much more defined focus. And I wanted to pose that question to you.
Well, you know, again, America has always felt it was something unique about itself. I mean, it always has been a semi-democracy, especially when it related to people of color, be they Asian, indigenous, and definitely Black folk. You know, see, I think, and this sounds very pessimistic, but there's a book out now by Frank Wilderson called Afro-Pessimism. He teaches Black studies out in California. And Wilderson argues that no matter what Black people do, and that he says this is something that's part of what the white race has always, how we've always been viewed by them, no matter what we do. If we invented a cure for COVID, which I have, a heart attack, cancer, sold it for a nickel, that white people will still see us as being inferior to them, that they see us as being subhuman. And a lot of people don't want to, say that's true, because obviously Black folk feel that we are human. But then you listen to this idiot president, this former president, Saturday night, when he started talking about, basically civil war, against Black people, and specifically against Black women who are investigating him. I don't think that most people classified as white see Black folk as being their equal. And I know that's a hard thing to say, but it's the truth. And I think that this continuing dialogue that we're supposed to be having about, are we, human, the Negro question, is being answered every day. They don't believe that we are. We know that we are, but they don't believe it. And they're responding accordingly. And I'm going to stop there with my pessimism. But that's what I believe. And I think that we're getting into a very dark period of the United States history. there will wind up being more violence towards Black folk as we are perceived to gain more power.
Thank you, Dr. Winbush. I think you make an excellent point when you think about what is considered progress, group progress over individual progress. And that goes to you, Dr. Scott. How about when we talk about the Negro question, white supremacy, and then let's have a layered nuance of that, what Dr. Khaled El-Hakim calls white absurdity. That means you're able to use microaggressions on a daily basis, particularly what we see now through the modernity of social media, where people ask you if you live in the building that you live in, if you are part of the body politic that is obviously American driven with American exceptionalism, meaning patriotism. How do we pull this together, Dr. Scott, and look at it, particularly looking at the layered nuances of what we see every day, daily rhythms, particularly those things that have to do with Blacks and whites sharing space and doing common things. But what Dr. Winbush has said, it's felt, it's understood that there's a separation in humanity and there's a superiority and inferiority. So I think about it through the terms of white absurdity. What do you think about that, Dr. Scott?
So I write about that actually in my book that's coming out, both in the book itself and in the epilogue. And it's a patrolling of racial boundaries. And so we see that same, it's an everyday patrolling of racial boundaries of Black existence, and it's a reinterpretation of what crime means. So if we look, for instance, in this post-emancipation era, when African Americans are freed and there's this reordering of a racial hierarchy, crime begins to take on a different meaning. So I write about lynching. If you look at lynching itself, the reasons why people are being lynched, writing a letter to a white woman, voting, attempting to get people to immigrate to Africa, everyday normal things, but when they are done by a Black person, they become criminalized. And so when you look at the list of why nearly 5,000 African Americans were lynched, many of them fall under those categories, speaking ill of a white family that was respected in the community, that are not causes for death among their white counterparts, but they are for African Americans. So if we come to our modern era, we see the patrolling of racial boundaries still. For instance, when Black children have the police called on them for selling lemonade, or somebody is questioned about living in a building because surely a Black person couldn't see that. We can open social media, open the newspapers, and see that those kinds of things continue to happen. What I'm hopeful for, though, is, because we have to move forward with these things, is number one, exposing people and helping people understand that this is a thing, and people seeing that more and more now, people watching the atrocities that happen on television and people being killed before their eyes for doing things that a white counterpart would not have done. It has shaken a lot of people out of their complacency, their comfort zone, and said, oh, damn, things are worse than I thought they were. And I'm encouraged specifically by a lot of the young people I see who, for instance, take classes on African-American history from me or from you or for others, who want to say, I want to understand this better so that I can move and navigate in the world better. That's where the hope comes from. That's where the progress comes from. And so that is where I find encouragement.
Dr. Peebles.
Yes, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, right now you're good.
Okay. Well, when we think about these daily rhythms and we see these attacks on many people, but more so Blacks in American society, for them going about their daily routine, and we think about the Negro question, can you connect the two and give us your thoughts?
Going about our daily routine, we see all these problems that come from white society. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Okay, good. Okay. It's that way because we have had to live that way with this society for almost 400 years. There has never been a time when actually Black people were progressive, or I say in numbers enough, or in enough material of necessities to fight, that had to, or whatever. We've always had to be on the receiving end of humility. We've always bowed our heads. So once a person bows his or her head, then that is looked upon that person to do that every time something comes up. The question you asked, I'm glad of that, because there are so many things that happened during the time of this conference that's still happening today. During the time of the conference, we were dealing with education, 1890, I think it was, the Henry Blair Education Bill, where they were trying to get schools for Black kids, you know, and South Black children, and et cetera, and whatever. And it didn't pass. It didn't pass. There was so much argument about it, but everybody's talking about at this conference what we're going to do with the Negro. And there are things coming at that particular same time of that conference that people are looking at, the whites are looking at, and just throwing them out. Then you had the Large Force Bill. 1890, Henry Cabot Lodge proposed the bill to Congress to federally supervise Southern elections aimed at securing equal voting rights for all African Americans. It passed the House, but fell down in the Senate on a 33-day filibuster. Same as today. We are trajectory, all of these things that once were had never stopped. The Dunning theorem, the Dunning-School theorem. That idea was the fact that white folks are the ones who are suffering because of this ideology that blacks are talking about, 1890, the African American Historical Society, excuse me. It advocated, they're saying that this society advocated white supremacy, Southern victimhood, you know, and victimhood and white experiences of slavery, the Civil War, and a detrimental operation for construction. That was old critical race theory then, at that particular time, that whites were recipients of a disaster of the Civil War. They were being victimized by slavery, etc. The Mississippi Constitutional Convention, 1890, began its systemic exclusion of blacks from all political arrangements by adopting literary tests and other outrageous methods in order to disqualify blacks from voting, which started voter suppression in Mississippi, spread into 7 states within 2 years. What are we talking about today? Voter suppression. Have we left the old adage that what we're going to do with the Negro problem? What is the Negro problem? It's not a Negro problem, it's a white problem. Our problem is that we just need enough force and folks to come out and stand up and teach like you're doing, you know. I mean, showing the seed for people to open their minds. If we're walking as a race into an open field of a plenty, but if we haven't been taught together and to get it and grasp it, we're going to always have our own problem. The Negro problem is our problem in that sense. Okay, let me just start.
Thank you, Dr. Peebles. We're going to go to a few comments and questions before we wrap up. We have some questions and comments we want to put forth while we have you all here, this august group. Somebody? Go ahead, Athalia.
So my question was, do you think that the question talked about in this conference directly relates to the incarceration rate and the labor that is experienced in the prison systems now?
Okay, so Athalia asked the question, does the Negro question, and I want to get this right, have an impact or directly correlates to the incarceration rate of Black people and the labor they experience in prison? Anybody who likes to take that, how do we connect the Negro question to the prison industrial complex?
I mean, I'll say something about that. If you think about the quote unquote Negro question as what do we do with individuals, there's not a monolith on this question, right? When we think about a white power structure saying, what do we do? What is a resolution? So when we think about how that might tie to mass incarceration, and we can begin with convict leasing at the turn of the last century, how does that tie to incarceration? People are being imprisoned as a form of racialized social control. Why can we say that? Because if we look at statistically what the criminal justice system looks like, African Americans spend more time in jail for a non-violent drug crime than their white counterparts do for a violent crime. They are in some places 4 to 14 times more likely to be sentenced to death for the same crime if it is a murder against a white body as their white counterparts. And so the criminal justice system, from the way that they are being prosecuted, starting with arrest rates and stop and frisk, to the prosecutors, to the sentencing of the judges, that becomes a system of racialized control that answers one part of that. What do we do with a group of people? Well, one part of that answer is imprison them and then make money off of their bodies in a private prison system.
Dr. Dixon.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. Go right ahead, Dr. Peebles.
I appreciate what the young lady has just spoken about.
It's a great question.
It made me think of a situation. Let's go back to slavery by another name. That was peonage. That was a time right during this time here when black guys, young black men, out of work, can't find work because nobody would hire them. They were told not to be hired because they want to have them for the new licensing law. You on the street, you don't have a job, you go to prison. So when you take these guys and put them in prison, by the thousands, by the dozen, all over the South, they are put into prison. But while they're in prison, the prisoners, the warrants of the state hire folk, sell them out to people who want to buy them to work. And so that started the great mass of influx into the prisons of the United States. These guys who were in prison sometimes never got out because they would do something they would be accused of doing something while they were in prison, and then they would just spend that much time there. So I just like to add that to what Dr. Scott it just said.
All right, Dr. Winbush, you connected the Negro question with this rise in the prison industrial complex. What's your thoughts?
Well, it's not a coincidence. I mean, we always talk about the 13th Amendment, the second part of that, where it talks about slavery, that it's this clause that allows us to be in prison. And as Dr. Scott said, we get in prison for almost anything historically, things that are, irrelevant. And then you wonder about the system itself. Like today, you probably heard about Ahmaud Arbery. They wanted to give them a more cushy sentence, and this is supposed to be, Biden's Justice Department. Thank God the people didn't allow that to happen, but they had to be challenged. It's almost like even though, we knew those men and saw those men kill Ahmaud Arbery, they were still trying to somehow give them a cushier sentence. And so it makes us skeptical and cynical about whether or not the system, in this sense, the justice system, really does want, punishment for whites who kill Black folk. And definitely it wants it for Black people who kill white folks, which is very rare, by the way. So I think we got to continue to struggle and realize that, we're struggling against a system that, again, doesn't want us to be a part of it.
Thank you, Dr. Winbush. Ms. Sorbo?
My question was more about
Go ahead, please. Mm-hmm.
Uncle Tom's Cabin book that came out, and some thoughts that the Klansmen were sent to the movie Birth of the Nation.
Okay.
Was a response to Uncle Tom's Cabin. Like the pendulum swings back that way. I was just wondering if anyone had thoughts on that.
Okay, I want to make sure I get it right. My understanding, Ms. Sorba, do we connect the Negro question to these avenues that influence like media with Birth of a Nation?
Birth of a Nation, the Birth of a Nation movie was predicated on that book.
The Klansman, the young man who wrote his last name is Dixon. Isn't that too close? That's way too close. But tell me if I got it right.
Yeah, I mean, because Uncle Tom's Cabin, was written in 1852.
Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Said that, there's a lot of, because of that, there's a lot of push towards the, more, that kind of thing. So we think that Negro question, the Negro question, the conference that happened, and then the subsequent, books and.
Okay.
And,
So if I got it right, Dr. Peebles and Dr. Scott, Dr. Winbush is checked out. He's not feeling well, so he did
I
his
understand.
work
Sorry.
just showing up. But I love him to death. So thank you, Doc. So the question Ms. Sorba posed is, when we talk about the Negro question, and we eventually see Uncle Tom's Cabin, Birth of a Nation, and those kind of movies, how did that? I hope I'm getting this right. How did that push to where we are and have those kind of conversations like we're having now? See, here's the thing that we had, Dr. Scott and Dr. Peebles, we had pushback from some folks who don't look like us about even having a conversation about the Negro question to this day and age. So that in itself is explaining the Negro question. If we want to have a conversation about the Negro question, there are folks who really believe that we shouldn't have this conversation. So what should be done in that particular phase? Well, make it very hard for them to have the conversation. But I think what Ms. Sorbers is saying is with the influence of media and then these very classic books that people look to, what kind of impact does that have then? And then how about now, if we could tie them together?
Well, I started. Okay.
Yeah, please answer, because I just hacked the question all the way up. I did.
Okay. Well, one thought that comes to me is that during the time of the convention here, this Mohawk convention, there were Black codes being set up at the same time. And there were images that were coming out concerning Black people in very derogative ways, over projection of facial features and et cetera, et cetera. And so this became just a feat, or just a hobby, or just a collector's item, just for people. But this was putting the image of the African American in the place as being a buffoon, a dummy. And so therefore the media picked up that particular element in society that Blacks suffered, and they went away with it. They just bloomed, went out. And so it has been just a few years back that we have been able to control or to tear down this proliferation of images of Black people as being clowns and dummies and monkeys.
Very straightforward, Dr. Peebles, and that's what we brought you for. Dr. Scott, if you want to answer that question, please feel free, and then we're going to have a last question by Esther. Go ahead, Dr. Scott.
Yeah, just to pick up where Dr. Peebles is talking about this imagery, one of the most detrimental impacts of The Birth of a Nation when it came out in 1915 was the imagery of Black men as rapists. And so that's where it became extraordinarily detrimental. And if you want to assume that popular culture does not create an issue in the broader culture, that's incorrect. We have the rebirth of the Klan and the repopularization of the Klan following the birth of the nation. You have President Woodrow Wilson, who shows it at the White House and lauds it for being such a quote unquote accurate depiction of history. But there's something else. And so by the 1920s, the movie combined with an influx of immigration of African Americans into towns and cities, as well as migration of African Americans into towns and cities and immigration of new immigrants into the country, the Klan becomes hugely popular. And so in Dallas, for instance, 1 out of every 3 white men over the age of 18 was a member of the Klan. In Chicago, you had tens of thousands, in Detroit, et cetera. But one of the other things that comes out of that is the NAACP, which was a fairly new organization by that time, they also launched campaigns in some cities to stop the showing of the birth of a nation. They rallied to say, no, we are not going to allow this alternate idea of Black people to be promoted. We are going to push against these Black misrepresentations in popular culture. And they continued to do so. The NAACP exists today. One of the women who is the head of the LDF, the Legal Defense Fund, which was started by the NAACP, Sherilyn Ifill, is being considered for a Supreme Court justice. So the alternate narrative there, the important narrative, is the narrative of resistance, of organization, and of resilience that we can learn from when we talk about things like the birth of a nation.
Excellent. Well put, Dr. Scott. Esther, please chime in with your question, and that'll be our last question for the night, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much for coming. This has been like incredibly informative. I think my question, especially when we start to think about, you know, the quote unquote, the Negro question and ideas of American exceptionalism, is how do you think posing that question affects Blackness across the diaspora? So when we start to think about, you know, Blackness in Europe, for example, Blackness on the continent of Africa, how does the Negro question and the concept of American exceptionalism, or the concept of African Americans as the only kind of representation of the Black experience, how do you think that question influences the way we now think about the diaspora as a whole?
So let me clarify the way we as people of African descent think about the diaspora as a whole, or?
Well, most thinking about, you know, the question of the Negro question as being a particularly kind of African American kind of question, particularly an African American kind of phenomenon. How do you think that question affects the way we think of Blackness outside of, you know, the African American experience? Do you think it influences it? Do you think it kind of hinders the other versions of the Black experience that are possibly beneficial to creating a very successful kind of collective and diaspora as well? So I hope that wasn't very convoluted, but I hope that makes sense.
No, not at all. I think it's a complex question with a complex answer. So I think that I wouldn't want to dwindle it down to one particular answer and then suggest that the African diaspora creates this monolith of people and how we think, because we don't. The way that race has been constructed in different countries is very regionally and historically specific. And so the way that Blackness versus whiteness is constructed in America is different, for instance, than Haiti or some other space of the African diaspora. So it would be a very challenging question to ask, I think that, or to answer rather, but an excellent one. I think that one of the things that has been very effective with the African diaspora is the way that both intellectually people have used, and ideologically, people have looked from the African diaspora to one another for a tutorial, for a primer, for answers on how to solve their own problems. When you think about African American leaders in the 1960s who were looking to West African leaders who were pushing for liberation from white colonizers and what they borrowed from them, and thinking about how to form their own movements here. When we think about how Frantz Fanon influenced civil rights workers here, when we think about how Black civil rights workers here influenced other oppressed people of color, I think that maybe there's a connection there in thinking about how we can look to one another to understand how to create a better world in the space that we are in. Does that help or start to answer part of your question?
No, that's perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for a wonderful conversation.
Well,
Go ahead, Dr. Peebles.
I was going to, in reference to her question, I would just like to add, I think that when we speak of the diaspora, of the Ma'afa, I call it, because diaspora is a Greek word, and Ma'afa has a different meaning. That most of the Ma'afa of the Black diaspora, most of it has been conquered all through the fact of manifest destiny of white people. This manifest destiny means European whites and well, the whole conglomeration of the white world has the mind, the mentality that we rule the world, we take over everything. Everybody that is not white, that is not Caucasian, everyone is subjected to whatever the glory of the European idea is of manifest destiny. We take what we want because we deserve it. We know how to, we were created, whites were created this way. They think in the book that we just read, they were created to be masters of the world. What we need to do, we need as Blacks, Pan-Africanism, is that when one thing affects Cuba or Haiti, it affects us and vice versa. That is one thing that we'll have to stress more. The Pan-Africanism of the day at Astra, I say the Ma'afa.
All right, Dr. Peebles, I thank you all for such a great conversation. Toby, if you can put the poster up real quick about Friday. Friday is our 4th annual student research conference. Toby, if you could put that up, thank you, sir. And we would like for all of you all to come out. And we have students, I think we got 13 students that will be presenting their research. So I think you will find at this time what the Black Studies Center does as far as research and forwarding the proclivity for research in the classroom here. So I thank you, Dr. Scott. I thank you, Dr. Peebles, once again.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon, for the
Thank you.
opportunity.
Yes, sir. And Dr. Scott, it's something I need to discuss with you, so we can do that at a later date.
Okay, sounds
All
good.
right. Well, thank you so much, you all. Toby, great job. Thank you, sir.
All right. Good
Thank
night.
you all.
Take
Have a
care,
good
everybody.
evening.
Thank you, Esther. All right, so
Absolutely. Take care.